He found solace in silence. The first time he donned the white paint, it was a revelation. Not a costume, but a shedding of skin. Words, once his only tools, felt clumsy, inadequate. His debut was in a bustling park. Children, initially wary, were drawn in. Of war with an invisible rope. Their laughter was his applause. He craved more. Larger crowds, grander stages. Each performance a deeper dive into the quiet world he was building. A world where expressions spoke louder than words, where silence was the most powerful sound. His silence seeped into his life off stage. Conversations dwindled to gestures, expressions. At first, a novelty. Friends amused, intrigued. He'd order coffee with a flick of his wrist, discuss the weather with a wave of his hand. It felt purer, more honest than the messy ambiguity of language. But amusement faded. Friends grew impatient. His silence, once charming, became an obstacle. They craved the comfort of words, the ease of shared sentences. He felt a pang of something. Regret? No. Vindication. Their world was loud, cluttered. His was a sanctuary of quietude. His performances grew in power. The silence, once a backdrop, became the main act. Audiences, initially entertained, now watched with a prickling unease. He'd contort his body, a puppet of unseen forces. He'd stare, eyes wide with silent terror, at something only he could see. Whispers followed him off stage. People pointed, faces a mixture of fascination and fear. He saw their apprehension, felt their unease. He reveled in it. Their fear was a testament to his power. Proof that silence could speak volumes, that it could stir something primal, unsettling. He woke one morning and realized he hadn't spoken in weeks. The silence had crept in slowly, like a fog rolling over a quiet town, until it became a part of him. Each day, he found himself less inclined to break it, to shatter the stillness with words that seemed increasingly unnecessary. His voice, a distant memory. It was as if it belonged to someone else, a relic of a past life. He wondered if he would even recognize it now, if he tried to speak. But the thought of trying felt foreign, almost intrusive. The thought, instead of alarming him, brought a strange sense of peace. There was a tranquility in the quiet, a serenity that words had always disrupted. He found solace in the absence of sound, a comfort in the void. He no longer needed words. They were cumbersome, clumsy tools that often failed to convey the depth of his thoughts and feelings. In silence, he found a purer form of expression. His world was one of expressions, gestures, the unspoken language of the soul. Every movement, every glance carried meaning. It was a dance of silent communication, more profound than any spoken word. The world of sound felt distant, irrelevant. The cacophony of voices, the constant barrage of noise, seemed like a distant echo, a background hum that no longer held any significance. He walked with a newfound lightness, a ghost gliding through a world of noise. The silence was his cloak, his shield, protecting him from the chaos around him. People seemed to part around him, their conversations dying down as he passed. It was as if they sensed his detachment, his separation from their noisy world. He was a void, an absence, a silent observer in a world that never stopped talking. He found a strange power in his quiet presence. He was the silence that stretched between the notes, the breath held before a scream. In the spaces between sounds, he found true self, a being defined not by words, but by the absence of them. He was becoming something else. Not just a man who had forgotten how to speak, but a man who had discovered the profound beauty of silence. In the quiet, he found his essence, his true identity. Section 5, A World Muted. The city shrunk around him. Streets, once familiar, now felt like a labyrinth. Faces blurred, their voices a dull roar. He was adrift in a sea of white noise. His performances became less about entertainment, more about revelation. He was a conduit, channeling something vast, unknowable. He'd stand perfectly still for minutes, an eternity in the human clock of attention. Then, a twitch, a spasm, as if fighting against invisible bonds, unseen forces. People would watch, transfixed, horrified. They couldn't look away. He was a mirror reflecting their deepest fears, their unspoken anxieties. Section 6. The grand spectacle, the grand theater, the pinnacle of his career. A place where dreams were both born and shattered. A stage where legends had tread, voices had soared. It was a sanctuary for the arts. A place where the echoes of past performances lingered in the air. He stood backstage, a silent specter in the bustling world of performers. The anticipation was palpable, a mix of fear and excitement that coursed through his veins. No elaborate sets, no prop, just a single spotlight and a silence so profound it thrummed in the air. The simplicity was haunting, yet it held a power that elaborate productions often lacked. The curtain rose. The silence deepened. It was as if the world held its breath, waiting for the first note, the first movement. He moved, not with the practiced grace of a performer, but with the jerky, unsettling movements of a marionette with tangled strings. Each step was a struggle, each gesture a battle against invisible forces. The audience was his. He felt their fear, their awe, their desperate need to understand. They were captivated, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding for them. He was a vessel, overflowing with the silence of the universe. In that moment, he was not just a performer. He was a conduit for something greater, something beyond the tangible world. His eyes, wide and unblinking, told a story of their own. His hands, reaching out, seemed to grasp at the very fabric of reality, pulling the audience into his world. The connection was undeniable. The audience leaned forward, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of sheer wonder. They were not just watching a performance, they were experiencing a moment of transcendence. As the final note hung in the air, he took a bow. The applause was thunderous, extraordinary. Section 7, An Empty Stage, the final act. He stood on the precipice of something immense, terrifying. The silence was a living thing now, coiling around him, pulling him under. He surrendered to it. His body moved in ways that defied gravity, logic. He was a shadow, a whisper, a figment of their collective imagination. Then nothing. The spotlight shone on an empty stage. A single white glove lay discarded, like a shed skin. The silence stretched, unbearable, deafening. The audience sat in stunned silence. Then a wave of whispers, murmurs, rising to a crescendo of confused shouts. He was gone. Section 8, Lingering Echoes. The theater was searched thoroughly, every nook and cranny examined with meticulous care. No trapdoors, no hidden exits. The stage, once alive with performances, now stood silent and empty, a ghost of its former self. Vanished, as if he had never been. The police investigated, baffled by the disappearance. They combed through every detail but found nothing. Some whispered of a supernatural occurrence, a ghostly presence that had spirited him away. Others spoke of cursed ancient legends, a man consumed by his own act. The mime, they said, had become one with the shadows, lost in the very performance he had perfected. Others, more practical, muttered about elaborate hoaxes, publicity stunts designed to draw attention. But the silence lingered. In the empty theater, in the hushed whispers of the city, the story grew. It became a legend, a tale told in hushed tones. In the uneasy feeling that something wasn't quite right, people felt a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that they couldn't shake off. He was gone, but his silence remained. The theater, once a place of joy and laughter, now echoed with an eerie stillness, a haunting echo of the man who had found solace in the absence of sound, a man who had become itself, and in doing so had unearthed something unsettling, something profound. The theater stood as a monument to his disappearance, a place where reality and illusion blurred.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at a horror story.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, and this one is particularly interesting because it really explores the dark side of insomnia,
Okay.
identity, and even maybe fate.
Interesting.
So the story follows this guy named Evan, and he's plagued by sleeplessness, and he encounters a figure that looks exactly like him. And it gets pretty creepy from there. Have you ever had that feeling of like being watched?
Oh, yeah.
Like somebody's shadowing your every move?
Totally.
Well, this story takes that feeling and really turns it up to 11. So
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really interesting is how the story uses the setting right away
Right.
to create the sense of unease.
Oh, for sure.
Like the empty city streets, the looming presence of this warehouse.
Yeah.
Like it all feels desolate and just charged with this kind of silent menace.
It's like the city itself is a character.
Yeah.
It's like holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. You can practically feel the cold air and hear Evan's echoing footsteps as he walks those deserted streets.
Totally. And then on top of that, you've got the doppelganger,
Yeah,
which adds a whole other layer of psychological terror.
totally. So can we talk about the doppelganger for a second? Sure. Like, what is it about that figure that's so inherently creepy?
Well, I mean, the doppelganger in literature, it often represents like our shadow self, like the part of us that we try to hide or deny.
Right.
And in this case, Evan's double really seems to embody all of his anxieties and his fears.
So it's like he's literally facing his darkest self.
Exactly. It's externalized and made flesh.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. And the way that the story ramps up the tension is masterful.
Oh, for sure.
Like each encounter with the doppelganger is more unsettling than the last.
Yeah.
And it leads to that moment where Evan hides from the approaching truck.
Oh, yeah.
Like, what did you make of that scene?
Oh, that scene for me was like brilliant foreshadowing of the danger to come. Like it's this glimpse into how inescapable Evan's situation really is, like a hint that something truly horrific is on the horizon.
Totally. And then, of course, you have that shocking discovery in the basement.
Oh my God, the basement.
Yeah, talk about a moment that just sends chills down your spine.
Right. It's not even just what he finds down there,
Right.
but the implications of it all.
Yeah, like, what do you think the author is trying to say with that?
Well, to me, the basement scene is where the story takes this really sharp turn
Mm-hmm.
into the truly macabre.
Right.
I mean, it's filled with bodies that all look like Evan.
Right.
And it suggests that he's trapped in some kind of horrifying cycle, like a repeating nightmare that he just can't escape.
And that's where things start to get really, really interesting, right?
Mm,
Like, are we dealing with a time loop here?
mm.
Is he destined to relive this horror over and over again?
That basement scene, I mean, it really throws a wrench into our understanding of the story.
Yeah, it's like stepping into a twisted funhouse mirror, where reality itself seems distorted and unreliable.
Mm.
And that feeling of unease, that feeling of not being able to trust your own senses,
Mm-hmm.
it just intensifies as the story progresses.
It really does. And it makes you wonder, is Evan actually making choices?
Right.
Or is he just a puppet being manipulated by some unseen force?
That's a great point, especially when we consider the possibility of a time loop, right?
Right.
If Evan is reliving these same events over and over again,
Yeah,
does he even have the ability to change his fate?
that's a good question.
Or is he just doomed to repeat this cycle of horror for all eternity?
Yeah, it's a bleak concept.
It's pretty bleak, but it's also incredibly compelling.
It is. And, the story doesn't shy away from that bleakness. It really embraces it, creating a suffocating atmosphere of inevitability.
Like Evan's growing sense of dread,
Yeah.
his realization that something terrible is about to happen.
Uh-huh.
It mirrors our own growing sense of unease as readers.
Totally. It's like we're right there with him, trapped in this nightmare,
Yeah.
powerless to stop what's coming. And that ending, oh man, that ending,
I know.
where he just accepts his fate,
Right.
knowing that he's going to be pulled back into this cycle of violence.
It's chilling.
It's terrifying. I think that ending is just a masterclass in psychological horror. There's
Okay.
no grand showdown, no heroic last stand,
Right.
just quiet, resigned acceptance of this horrifying reality.
And it leaves you with this lingering sense of unease.
Totally.
Like this feeling that maybe we're all trapped in our own personal cycles of fear and despair.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It's definitely not a story you forget easily.
No.
Like it gets under your skin and it stays with you.
Hmm.
It makes you question your own sense of control, your own place in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. And that's what good horror is all about, right?
Yeah, it's not about the jump scares or the gore.
Right.
It's about tapping into those primal fears,
Yeah,
the anxieties that lurk in the back of our minds and forcing us to confront them head on.
exactly.
So speaking of confronting fears, I have to ask, what did you make of the cyclical nature of the narrative?
Mm.
Do you think the time loop itself is like a metaphor for something deeper?
That's a fascinating question. I think it could be interpreted in a few different ways.
Okay.
On one level, it represents the repetitive nature of trauma.
Okay.
The way that certain events can just keep replaying in our minds,
Right.
haunting us long after they've occurred.
So it's like a psychological prison.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Evan's constantly reliving his worst nightmare.
But on another level, the time loop could also be seen as a commentary on the human tendency to repeat our mistakes,
Right.
to fall back into destructive patterns of behavior.
Yes. It's like we're all caught in our own personal loops,
Right.
making the same choices,
Yeah.
experiencing the same consequences over and over again.
It's a pretty bleak outlook,
It is.
but I can see how it fits with the overall tone of the story,
Right.
this sense of inescapable doom,
Mhm.
this feeling that we're all just cogs in a machine far larger than ourselves.
It all comes back to the question of free will, right?
Right.
If we are indeed trapped in these cycles, these predetermined patterns,
Yeah.
can we ever truly break free?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is a big one.
It's a heavy question,
Mm.
and one that the story doesn't provide any easy answers to.
No, it doesn't. But I think that's part of what makes it so thought-provoking.
Oh.
And to ask ourselves, are we truly in control of our own destinies?
It's definitely a story that makes you think,
For sure.
and maybe even lose a little sleep. But that's what good horror is all about, right?
And in this case, the horror lingers long after you finish reading.
Yeah.
It makes you contemplate the nature of reality, the power of fear,
Right.
and the unsettling possibility that we might not be as free as we think we are.
So much to unpack there. Okay, so we've talked about the unsettling atmosphere,
Mm.
the heart-stopping basement reveal, and of course the whole concept of the doppelganger.
Right.
But you know what I keep coming back to?
What's that?
This idea of the time loop.
Yeah.
Do you think the author intended it as like a literal time loop? Or is it more of a metaphorical representation of something else?
That's a really good question. I mean, it really gets to the heart of the story's ambiguity.
Right.
Like, on the one hand, you have the narrative presenting these repeating events,
Uh-huh.
this sense of inevitability
Yeah.
that suggests an actual, like, literal time loop.
Right.
But on the other hand, the story never explicitly confirms it.
That's true.
So it leaves room for other interpretations.
So it's like the author's inviting us to question the nature of reality itself,
Yeah.
to consider that, things might not be as straightforward as they seem.
Exactly. And I think that ambiguity is part of what makes the story so effective.
Oh, totally.
It forces us to engage with the text on a deeper level, right? To fill in the gaps with our own interpretations and anxieties.
So even if we can't definitively say whether or not it's a literal time loop, the very possibility of it adds this whole other layer of psychological terror.
For sure. Like, it creates this sense of claustrophobia, this feeling of being trapped
Right.
in a situation where there's no escape.
And that feeling is just amplified by the cyclical nature of the violence.
Oh, yeah.
The way that Evan seems destined to both inflict and experience the same horrifying fate over and over again.
It's a disturbing concept, for sure.
It is.
But it does raise some interesting questions.
Right. Like, what is it?
About the nature of identity and agency.
Okay.
I mean, if we're constantly reliving the same events, making the same choices, are we really in control of our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It's a question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
Right.
And the story just takes that age-old debate and frames it within the context of this chilling horror narrative.
And it does so with this masterful blend of psychological insight
Yes.
and atmospheric dread. I mean, this story isn't just about scares. It's about exploring the darkest corners of the human psyche.
Totally.
Those places where fear and despair take root.
It's about the fragility of our sense of self, the unsettling realization that we might be more vulnerable than we care to admit,
Right.
more susceptible to forces beyond our control.
And that is a truly terrifying thought.
It is.
This story doesn't offer any easy answers,
No, it doesn't.
but it certainly leaves a lasting impression.
It does. It's a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling horror
Yeah.
is the kind that stays with you long after you've finished reading,
Uh-huh.
the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about reality and the nature of your own existence.
Wow. Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about.
It has.
It's a story that will stay with me for a long time, and I suspect it will do the same for our listeners.
I think so too.
So if you're looking for a horror story that'll challenge you intellectually and emotionally,
Yeah,
this is definitely one to check out.
for sure.
Just be prepared to lose a little sleep.
Maybe keep the lights on.
Yeah, good advice. Thanks for joining us on this chilling exploration of fear, identity, and the unsettling power of the unknown.
The town of Cold Pines was quiet, peaceful, Then came the screams. Thomas Hooper, the quiet librarian, shattered the peace. He brutally attacked his neighbors, claimed they were vessels, tools for the void. Hooper's trial became a spectacle, a small town facing unimaginable horror. His only defense? The void made him do it. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, locals, everyone wondering the same thing. Was Thomas Hooper mad, or was something truly evil at play? The tension was thick. A cold dread settled over everyone as Hooper spoke. His voice was flat, empty, like a grave speaking. Hooper sat in the stand, eyes hollow. His gaze seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the courtroom, as if he was looking into another realm entirely. The room was filled with an uneasy silence, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. He spoke of the void, a place of unimaginable darkness and despair. His voice trembled as he described it, each word dripping with fear and uncertainty. A whispering darkness that invaded his mind. It was as if the shadows themselves had come to life, whispering secrets and promises that no mortal should ever hear. Told him to cleanse the town. His words were chilling. He recounted how the void had shown him visions of a town consumed by darkness, a place where no light could penetrate. He described the void's voice, insistent, demanding. It was a voice that promised power, but at a terrible cost, a voice that would not be ignored, promising power in exchange for obedience. The allure of such power was almost too much to resist, but the price was steep. Obedience to a force that sought only destruction.
The void, it whispered to me. It told me things, showed me things that no human should ever see. It was like a dark, insidious presence that had taken root in my very soul, told me they were vessels, tools for the cleansing. The people of the town were nothing more than pawns in a game of cosmic horror, their lives insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
The jury listened, captivated and horrified. Their faces a mix of disbelief and fear, as if they too could feel the presence of the void creeping into their minds. Hooper recounted his descent into madness, each word a step deeper into the abyss, each sentence a further unraveling of his sanity, the growing influence of the void. It was a force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, its tendrils reaching further into his mind, his own struggle for control. It was a battle he was losing, a fight against an enemy that could not be seen or touched, but was always there. His words painted a terrifying picture, a world where darkness reigned supreme and the light was but a distant memory. Was it the rambling of a madman, or a terrifying truth that nobody wanted to believe? The courtroom was left to ponder this question, the weight of Hooper's words hanging heavy in the air. Dr. Peter Sampson, a renowned psychiatrist, took the stand. He had examined Hooper. His conclusion, paranoid schizophrenia, a break from reality. This diagnosis was not made lightly. It was the result of extensive evaluations and numerous sessions with Hooper. Dr. Sampson had delved deep into Hooper's psyche, uncovering layers of trauma and delusion that had built up over years. The void, Dr. Sampson explained, was a delusion. It was a manifestation of Hooper's deepest fears and anxieties, a place where his mind was an empty space. Hooper's past, his regrets, and his unfulfilled desires, a figment of Hooper's broken mind. His perception of reality had been so distorted that he could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. This break from reality was not sudden, but a gradual descent into madness. His crimes, a consequence of mental illness. The acts he committed were not out of malice, but out of a desperate attempt to make sense of the chaos in his mind. The community was left grappling with the aftermath, trying to understand how such horror could stem from one man's suffering.
History shows clear signs of a mind unraveling. Insomnia, anxiety, increasing isolation. These were not just isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of deteriorating mental health. Each symptom was a cry for help, a signal that something was terribly wrong. These are symptoms of a severe mental illness. They indicate a person struggling to maintain a grip on reality, someone who is slowly losing the battle against their inner demons. The signs were there, but they were either ignored or misunderstood.
Samson spoke with authority. His years of experience and deep understanding of the human mind lent weight to his words. He was not just presenting a diagnosis. He was telling the story of a man who had been failed by the system. He presented Hooper's history of insomnia, anxiety, and increasing isolation. Each entry in the medical records was a testament to Hooper's struggle, a piece of the puzzle that explained his tragic actions. Clear signs of a mind unraveling. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of a man who had been in a downward spiral for years. His mental state had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function in society. The courtroom listened intently. Was this the answer? Could understanding Hooper's mental illness provide the closure the community so desperately needed? The jurors were faced with the difficult task of separating the man from his actions. A simple, if tragic, explanation for the horror that had gripped their town. The community had been searching for answers, and now they were confronted with the harsh reality of mental illness. It was a sobering reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the importance of compassion and understanding. The defense called a different kind of expert. Dr. Emily Carter, a paranormal investigator, specialized in unexplained phenomena. Her testimony sent chills down everyone's spines.
There are ancient forces, dark entities that can influence the minds of men. I believe Hooper's void could be real.
She spoke of similar cases, people driven to violence by unseen forces. Her words hung in the air, unsettling and impossible to dismiss. Could Hooper truly be a puppet, controlled by something ancient and evil? The courtroom sat on edge, caught between skepticism and creeping terror. Father Michael O'Brien, a respected theologian, offered a different perspective.
He spoke of demonic possession, of evil entities seeking to corrupt the souls of men.
He argued Hooper's void could be a demon.
Its whispers, a temptation leading to violence and despair.
Father O'Brien spoke with quiet conviction. He described the ancient battle between good and evil.
He warned that darkness could take many forms.
The courtroom was silent. Hooper's case was no longer just about madness or sanity. It had become a battleground of faith, a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that might lurk in the shadows.
The void demands silence.
As the trial progressed, Hooper's behavior grew more erratic. His once composed demeanor began to crumble, revealing a man on the edge of sanity. The courtroom, once a place of order and justice, became a stage for his unraveling. He muttered to himself, eyes darting around the courtroom as if he saw things others couldn't. His whispers were incoherent, filled with fragments of thoughts that made little sense to those around him. It was as if he was conversing with unseen entities, trapped in a dialogue only he could hear. His outbursts became more frequent. What started as occasional murmurs escalated into full-blown tirades. The courtroom echoed with his cries, each one more desperate than the last. He would shout at the judge, the jury, even the empty gallery. His accusations were wild, his anger palpable. He seemed to believe that everyone was part of a grand conspiracy against him. Each outburst filled the room with a palpable sense of dread. The spectators, once curious, now watched in horror as Hooper descended further into madness. The air grew thick with tension, and an unspoken fear spread among those present.
The void is speaking to me. It grows angrier with each passing day. The voices, once mere whispers, had become deafening roars in his mind. He clutched his head, trying to block out the relentless noise, but it was futile.
The whispers he'd once described grew into shouts. They were no longer just in his head. They seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the courtroom. The void, as he called it, was no longer a distant presence, but a looming force. He claimed the void was speaking to him, growing angrier with each passing day of the trial. His proclamations were met with skepticism, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. It was as if he was being consumed from within. The line between reality and delusion blurred. Hooper's grip on sanity was slipping, and it was unclear whether he was a victim of his own mind or something far more sinister. His reflection in the mirror seemed to mock him, a distorted version of the man he once was. Was Hooper blind, or was there a darker force at play, manipulating his thoughts and actions? The courtroom was left to ponder these questions as the man before them was a shadow of his former self. Or was the void tightening its grip, preparing for something terrible? The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment, as if the very air was charged with impending doom. The trial was no longer just about justice. It was a battle for Hooper's soul.
The void demands silence.
The climax came during closing arguments. Hooper, in a terrifying display of rage, leaped from his seat. He screamed, "The void demands silence!" He lunged at the jury, eyes wild with madness. Bailiffs tackled him, struggling to restrain his unexpected strength. The courtroom erupted in chaos. People screamed, fleeing for the exits. The judge pounded his gavel, his voice lost in the pandemonium. In that moment of terror, Hooper's claims seemed all too real. The void, it seemed, had made its presence known. But was it a demonic entity, a figment of madness, or something else entirely? The jury, visibly shaken, delivered their verdict guilty. Hooper, deemed mentally unfit for trial, was sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility. The town of Cold Pines slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the fear remained. The memory of Hooper's chilling testimony lingered like a shadow. Was Thomas Hooper merely a madman, or had he been a conduit for something ancient and evil? The question remained unanswered, a chilling mystery that continued to haunt the town of Cold Pines. Hooper remained in the asylum. He never spoke of the void again. But sometimes late at night, nurses swore they heard him whisper that he spoke to someone or something. And when they looked into his eyes, a vast, empty darkness that stared back, the void, silent, waiting, and the town of Cold Pines would never forget the chilling possibility that it might whisper again.
The train rattled on, each clank of the wheels another step into oblivion. Outside, skeletal trees clawed at the night sky, a desolate landscape illuminated only by the pale moon. I was alone, or so I thought. My ticket stub read Rathmeath, a name that echoed with the promise of oblivion. The air grew colder, heavy, with a nameless dread. Fear, cold and began to claw its way into my heart. The carriage was a tomb. Shadows danced on the dusty floor, stirred by the flickering gaslight. An unsettling silence hung of the train. Whispers, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the very walls. Or was it my imagination? My reflection in the grimy window stared back, a stranger with haunted eyes. Each gust of wind that rattled the carriage seemed to whisper Rathmeath. The sent shivers down my spine. The train screeched to a halt, the sound like a death rattle. Rathmeath. The station was a skeletal husk consumed by shadows. The air was deathly still, heavy with the scent of decay. A single flickering lamp cast grotesque shadows that danced on the dilapidated platform. Stepping onto the platform, I felt a presence, something cold and watchful. A shiver ran down my spine. I was not alone. A figure stood at the edge of the platform, shrouded in darkness, waiting. He turned, his face obscured by the shadows of a wide hat, but his eyes burned with a cold, ethereal light. They held an ancient sorrow, a depth of despair that chilled me to the bone. "This is Rathmeath." His voice was a dry rasp, like the whisper of dead leaves. The end of the line. His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He gestured toward the forest that pressed close to the station, a wall of darkness. "Follow me," he beckoned. "The well awaits." The trees closed in around us, their branches twisted and gnarled like the limbs of tormented souls. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The moon, a pale sliver in the sky, offered no comfort in this place of perpetual twilight. Each step, my feet sinking into the soft, yielding earth. The silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Fear, prime-consuming, tightened its grip on my throat. Deeper and deeper we ventured, the forest floor littered with the skeletal remains of fallen trees. The air hummed with a strange energy, a palpable sense of dread that pressed down on me like a physical weight. Whispers seemed to emanate from the very trees. The figure in front of me moved with an unnatural grace, gliding effortlessly over the uneven ground. He never looked back, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and calculating. A sense of doom settled over me, heavy and suffocating. We emerged into a clearing, the trees parting to reveal a sight that sent a chill down my spine. In the center stood a well, its stones ancient and covered in moss. A faint bluish light emanated from the depths, casting flickering shadows that danced on the surrounding trees. "A well of sorrows," the figure rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Gaze into its depths and you shall see your fate." He stepped aside, his eyes boring into me, daring me to approach. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled towards the well, drawn by an unseen force. As I peered into the abyss, the bluish light intensified, swirling and pulsing like a beating heart. Images flashed before my eyes, fragments of memories, both real and imagined, all twisted and distorted. I saw my past, my present, and a future filled with unimaginable horror. The reflection staring back at me was not my own. It was a grotesque mockery, a twisted reflection of my deepest fears and darkest desires. A scream rose in my throat, but no sound escaped my lips. I was trapped, frozen in place by the horrifying truth revealed in the well's depths. The ground beneath me seemed to dissolve, and I felt myself falling, tumbling endlessly into the abyss. The bluish light consumed me, searing my eyes with its cold fire. The whispers grew louder, transforming into screams that echoed through the void. Panic surged through me, but it was too late. The darkness had me now, wrapping around me like a shroud. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. This was my fate, my eternal prison. Time ceased to exist. I was adrift in a sea of darkness, my mind a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and half-remembered nightmares. And then, a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from within my own skull. "You are home now," it hissed. "Welcome to eternity." My eyes flew open. I was back in the train carriage. The train rattled on, the scenery outside unchanged. Had it all been a dream, a cruel trick of the mind? But as I looked down at my hand, I saw it, a single drop of water, glowing faintly blue in the palm of my hand. The well's mark. My heart turned to ice. It was not a dream, it was my reality, and it would never end.
The house stood at the end of Harbinger Lane. Shrouded, its silhouette loomed ominously against the dimming sky, a relic of a bygone era that seemed to resist the passage of time. The air around it was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. Towering oaks, their branches gnarled and skeletal, blotted out the sun. These ancient sentinels seemed to guard the house, their twisted limbs casting eerie shadows that danced on the ground like spectres. The trees whispered secrets to those who dared to listen, their leaves rustling with tales of the past. The paint peeled from the siding like scabs, revealing the rotting wood beneath. Each flake of paint that fell was a testament to the years of neglect, a silent cry for the care that never came. The house's exterior, once proud and stately, now stood as a monument to decay and abandonment. Windows, once bright eyes, were now vacant sockets staring out blankly. They seemed to follow you no matter where you stood, as if the house itself was watching, judging. The broken glass glinted in the dim light, adding to the sense of desolation. This was a place where shadows lingered, where whispers danced on the wind, where secrets festered like wounds. The overgrown foliage seemed to encroach upon the house, as if nature itself sought to reclaim what had been abandoned. The wind carried with it the faintest echoes of laughter and sobs, memories of lives long past. Inside, dust lay thick as a shroud. It covered every surface, a testament to the years of silence and stillness. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and age, a reminder of the life that once thrived within these walls. It coated the furniture, the faded floral wallpaper, the cracked porcelain dolls lining the dusty shelves. Each item told a story, a fragment of a life once lived. The dolls, with their lifeless eyes and cracked faces, seemed to watch over the room, guardians of forgotten memories. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of decay and the weight of forgotten memories. Every breath taken within these walls felt like inhaling the past, a past that refused to be forgotten. The decay was not just physical but emotional, a lingering sorrow that permeated every corner. Each room held a palpable emptiness, a void that seemed to suck the very life out of anything that dared to enter. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards, as if the house itself was restless. The house on Harbinger Lane was more than just an empty vessel. It was a repository of emotions, a place where the past and present coexisted in a delicate balance. The very walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a life that was both haunting and mesmerizing. It was a living, breathing entity, its walls imbued with the sorrows and sins of those who had walked its halls. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of the wind, was a reminder of the lives that had been intertwined with this place. The house held their secrets, their joys and their sorrows, all woven into its very fabric. It was a place of whispers and shadows, where the line between the living and the dead blurred like watercolors on a canvas. The house seemed to exist in a realm of its own, a place where time stood still and the past was ever present. It was a place that beckoned to the curious, the brave and the foolish, promising them a glimpse into the unknown, a journey into the heart of darkness itself. The anniversary arrived cloaked in silence, a year since she vanished. John sat staring at the phone, the receiver cold and lifeless in his hand. He hadn't taken it off the hook, not since that last call. The one where the voice on the other end, small and afraid, had whispered, "Daddy," before dissolving into static.
"It's been a year,"
Mary whispered, her voice raspy, unused. John remained silent, his gaze fixed on the phone. A year of dead ends, of false hope, of gnawing guilt. The weight of it pressed down on him, threatening to crush him.
"We have to move on,"
Mary said, her voice cracking. John finally looked up, his eyes meeting Mary's. Move on? How could they move on when a piece of them was still lost in the shadows? The restaurant buzzed with forced gaiety. The air was thick with the scent of various dishes, a blend of spices and aromas that should have been appetizing but felt overwhelming. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation created a cacophony that seemed to press in on John from all sides. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the overly cheerful music, it all grated on John's nerves. He felt a sense of dissonance, as if he were out of sync with the world around him. The laughter and joy that filled the room seemed like a cruel mockery of his own inner turmoil. 2 years. 2 years since their lives had been shattered. The passage of time had done little to heal the wounds. Each day felt like a struggle, a battle to maintain a facade of normalcy. The calendar might have flipped through the months, but the pain remained as fresh as ever. 2 years of pretending to be normal, to be whole. They had become experts at it, wearing masks that hid their true feelings. But tonight, in this crowded restaurant, the masks felt heavier than ever. The weight of their shared grief was almost palpable, a silent presence at their table. He glanced at Mary, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The lines of worry and sorrow etched into her features were starkly visible. She looked fragile, as if a single harsh word could shatter her completely. The light seemed to drain the color from her face, leaving her looking ghostly and ethereal. She picked at her food, her eyes distant, haunted. Each bite seemed to be an effort, a mechanical action devoid of any real interest or appetite. Her mind was clearly elsewhere, lost in memories that were too painful to revisit, but impossible to forget. A family entered the restaurant, their laughter jarring in the tense silence John carried with him. The sight of them, so carefree and happy, was like a knife twisting in his heart. He envied their innocence, their unburdened joy. It was a stark contrast to the heavy sorrow that weighed him down. He watched as they were led to a table, his gaze drawn to a young girl trailing behind them. There was something about her that caught his attention, a familiarity that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. He couldn't look away, his eyes following her every move. Her hair, the color of wheat in sunlight, fell in waves around her shoulders. It shimmered in the light, a golden halo that seemed almost otherworldly. The sight of it brought a rush of memories. Her eyes, large and bright, held a spark of mischief. They were the kind of eyes that seemed to see everything, to understand more than they should. There was a liveliness in them that was both captivating and heartbreaking. John's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. The resemblance was too strong, too uncanny. It was as if he were seeing a ghost, a spectre from his past come to him. His heart pounded in his chest, a wild, frantic rhythm. He couldn't tear his gaze away. Every instinct screamed at him to look closer, to be sure. But the more he looked, the more certain he became. It was like a dream, a cruel trick of the mind. The girl's laugh, high and clear, sent shivers down his spine. It was a sound he had thought he would never hear again, a melody that had been silenced by tragedy. The familiarity of it was both a comfort and a torment. It was her laugh, his daughter's laugh. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, overwhelming and inescapable. It brought with it a flood of memories, each one painful than the last, but that was impossible. His daughter was gone. The rational part of his mind fought against the hope that was rising within him. It couldn't be her. It was just a coincidence, a cruel twist of fate. Mary stood beside him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. The warmth of her touch was a grounding force, a reminder that he was not alone in his grief. She had always been his anchor, the one who kept him from drifting away into despair.
John? What is it? Her voice was soft, filled with concern. She could sense his distress, the turmoil that was roiling within him. She had always been attuned to his emotions, able to read him like an open book.
He wanted to tell her, to share the impossible hope that had taken root in his heart, but he was afraid of what it would mean, of the pain it could bring. The words hovered on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say them. To say, "Look, it's her, our little girl." The words echoed in his mind, a desperate plea. He wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. But the fear of being wrong, of reopening old wounds, held him back. But the words died in his throat. He couldn't voice the hope that was clawing at his insides. It was too fragile, too precious. He was terrified of shattering it, of losing it forever. Hope, that flickering flame he'd tried so hard to extinguish, flared back to life, threatening to consume him. It was a dangerous thing, hope. It could lift you up, but it could also bring you crashing down. And yet, in that moment, he couldn't help but hold on to it, even if it was just for a little while longer. The house was silent as John slipped through the front door. The night was still, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. He moved with the caution of someone who had done this many times before, each step calculated to avoid the creaky floorboards. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. It was a rhythm he couldn't control, a physical manifestation of the turmoil inside him. Every beat seemed louder than the last, echoing in the silence of the house. He closed the door softly behind him, the click echoing in the silence. The sound was almost deafening in the quiet, a stark reminder of the secrecy of his actions. He paused for a moment, listening for any signs of movement, but the house remained silent. In the living room, bathed in the moonlight streaming through the grimy windows, sat Mary. She looked like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, adding to the surreal atmosphere.
John, where have you been? Her voice trembled, the worry evident in every syllable. She had been waiting, the hours stretching into an eternity, each minute filled with dread.
Her voice was sharp, laced with worry and a hint of accusation. He didn't answer. He couldn't find the words to explain, to justify his actions. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He couldn't. Not yet. The truth was too heavy, too complicated. He needed more time, but time was a luxury he didn't have. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing the small figure standing behind him. The child had been hidden in the shadows, her presence a secret he had guarded fiercely. A girl, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, peered out from behind him. She clung to his leg, her small hands gripping his pants tightly. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The shock was evident on her face, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the child. She had not expected this, not in her wildest dreams.
John, who is that? Her voice was barely a whisper, the question hanging in the air between them. She needed answers, but she was afraid of what they might be.
She's ours, Mary. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension. He knew this was a lot to take in, and he braced himself for her reaction.
The girl took a hesitant step forward, her eyes never leaving Mary's face. She was scared, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a longing for acceptance.
Mommy? Her voice was small, tentative. She was seeking confirmation, a connection to the woman standing before her.
She whispered, her voice barely audible. The word hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting the past and the present. Tears streamed down Mary's face as she rushed to the girl, engulfing her in a hug so tight it was almost painful. The emotions were overwhelming, a flood of relief, joy, and sorrow all at once. John watched, a strange mix of relief and dread washing over him. He had done what he thought was right, but the consequences were still unknown. He'd brought her home, but at what cost? The future was uncertain, and the weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. He could only hope that they would find a way to move forward together.
In shadows deep I walk alone, an island adrift I call my throne. Voices whisper dark as stone, echoes of a life unknown. Call to the void, I hear its song, a place where I might belong. In this world I felt so wrong, the void calls us all along. Faces blur in crowded halls, detached from those with empty walls. Silent cries in midnight calls, drawn to where the darkness falls. Call to the void, I hear its song, a place where I might belong. In this world I felt so wrong, the void calls us all along. Come with me, I'll guide your way to the silence where shadows play. Leave behind the light of day, into the void we'll sway. And mirrors crack, reflections fade, lost in time without a shade. In the void where dreams are made, let's embrace this dark parade. Oh, 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 oh. In mirrors cracked, reflections fade, lost in time without a shade. In the void where dreams are made, let's embrace this dark parade.
The Cult of the Sacred Worm. Good evening, and welcome to a deeper dive into one of history's most chilling enigmas, the Cult of the Sacred Worm. This evening, we will expand on the lore surrounding this mysterious belief system, uncover alleged connections to ancient civilizations, and explore modern conspiracy theories that suggest its influence has persisted into our own time. Prepare yourself, truth and speculation are about to intertwine. Lore of the Sacred Worm. The sacred worm, referred to in recovered texts as Saranaxis, the coiled one, or Umbracana, the shadow burrower, is believed to have been worshipped as both a god and an oracle. The cult's lore paints the worm as a being of vast intelligence and terrifying power, far removed from anything human or earthly. Over time, stories emerged of its alleged origin, purpose, and connection to humanity. Origins of the worm. According to fragmentary carvings and myths, the worm is said to have descended into the earth from the void. Some interpret this as evidence of an extraterrestrial origin, possibly a being from another dimension. Others argue it could be a manifestation of primal fears, earthly yet deeply alien. Legends claim the worm slumbered deep beneath the earth's surface, feeding on the collective thoughts and emotions of its worshippers. Over centuries, it allegedly grew more powerful, its voice reaching into the minds of the cultists to deliver commands. The worm's purpose. A recurring theme in cave paintings and relics is the idea that the worm had a purpose. It sought to transform the world into a garden for its kind. Sacrifices were not merely acts of devotion, they were meant to reshape the fabric of reality, altering human consciousness to pave the way for the worm's brood. The cult's practices. The cult of the sacred worm was not a single group, but a network of isolated sects operating independently yet bound by shared symbols and rituals. Each sect believed they were caretakers of the worm, tasked with ensuring its survival and carrying out its will. Rituals reportedly involved ceremonial feasts, blood offerings, and elaborate dances designed to mimic the worm's movements. Some accounts suggest that the cult consumed hallucinogenic substances to achieve a shared trance state, claiming to hear the worm's song, a low-frequency vibration said to induce both ecstasy and fear. Influence on ancient civilizations. There are speculative links between the cult of the sacred worm and several ancient civilizations. While mainstream archaeology dismisses these connections as coincidental, proponents of alternative history argue otherwise. The Atacama Desert and Nazca Lines. The Atacama cave paintings share thematic similarities with the nearby Nazca Lines, particularly the spiraling patterns found in some glyphs. Could these patterns represent the worm's coiled form? Some theorists believe the Nazca Lines were created by cultists as offerings to guide the worm's return. Ancient China. In the forests of China, stories of earth serpents abound in ancient texts. A notable example is the Shanhai Jing, classic of mountains and seas, which describes subterranean creatures that burrow through the soul, not the soil. Could these be distorted accounts of the sacred worm's influence? Siberian megaliths. In Siberia, certain ancient megalithic sites align with rumored cult activities. The Sayan Mountains are home to peculiar carvings depicting serpentine figures intertwined with human forms. Local folklore speaks of shamans who descended into the underworld to speak with the earthworm god. Modern conspiracy theories. The cult of the sacred worm may not be a relic of the past. Numerous conspiracy theories suggest that the cult, or its ideological successors, continues to operate in the shadows, influencing modern events and possibly harboring the worm, or its descendants. Sightings of the coiled symbol. Reports of the coiled worm symbol have emerged in unexpected places, on the walls of abandoned factories, in graffiti near sites of mysterious disappearances, and even on rare ancient coins unearthed in unrelated archaeological digs. Some claim the symbol has been seen at gatherings of secret societies, fueling speculation that the cult has infiltrated modern organizations. Influence on global events. Conspiracy theorists propose that the cult's alleged goal of reshaping human consciousness aligns with certain technological or political movements. For example, some argue that the advent of mass surveillance and data mining serves as a modern worm song, subtly manipulating human behavior. The worm's biological legacy. There are rumors of secret government experiments to uncover or replicate the worm's supposed mind control abilities. A 2013 whistleblower claimed that a classified program, codenamed Project Ouroboros, was investigating parasitic organisms capable of altering neurological pathways, a direct nod to the worm's legendary abilities. Another chilling theory suggests the worm was never a single entity, but a species. Could descendants of the original sacred worm still exist, burrowing deep beneath the earth or hiding in uncharted regions? The worm as a tool for power. The most sinister theory posits that powerful elites have co-opted the cult's practices for their own ends. This version of the cult does not worship the worm, but uses its alleged abilities to control populations, ensuring obedience through psychological manipulation. Anecdotal reports have surfaced from individuals claiming encounters with either the cult or the worm itself. In 1987, a group of miners in Siberia reported encountering a massive, coiling thing while drilling deep underground. The government allegedly sealed the site, declaring biological hazard. Survivors later recounted vivid dreams of a voice commanding them to dig further. The Atacama Caravan, 2010, a tourist group in the Atacama Desert, claimed to have seen faint, glowing spirals on a cave wall at night. Upon returning to the site the next day, they found no markings. Several members of the group reported recurring nightmares and a strange compulsion to return to the desert. Corporate links. Present-day online sleuths have pointed to the use of coiled worm imagery in logos and designs of certain corporations involved in bioengineering and artificial intelligence. Could this be an homage to the worm, or a hint at a deeper connection? Conclusion: the eternal mystery. The cult. Whether the worm is an ancient myth, an extraterrestrial entity, or a metaphor for humanity's darkest impulses, its influence endures in the fears and whispers it has left behind. If the cult persists today, one final question looms: what does the worm want? Is it a being with its own agenda, or a tool of those who wield power in its name? The answer may forever elude us, or perhaps we are too afraid to uncover it. Thank you for joining me tonight. Stay vigilant and tread carefully, for you never know what lies beneath your feet.
The Silent Journal. Entry 1, The Lure of Silence. They called it art. They called it freedom. But for me, mine was salvation. I remember my first performance vividly: painted face, gloved hands, a prison of imaginary walls. For once, the world didn't demand words. My gestures told the stories my mouth could not. The applause affirmed it. I didn't need to speak to exist. But tonight, something changed. I stayed in character longer than usual, long after the curtain fell. Walking home, I glided as if on an invisible breeze, dodging unseen obstacles. My neighbors waved. I responded only with exaggerated pantomime. I didn't realize how liberating it was until I got home and looked in the mirror. I hadn't spoken a single word all day. Entry 8, The Mask Fits. The face paint is a mask, yes, but it feels like a truer version of me. When I paint it on, my reflection becomes something honest. It feels like the me I've always been too afraid to show. The world is cruel, loud, demanding. Words are weapons, used to wound, to deceive. I see it everywhere, the lies exchanged by couples at the cafe. the hypocrisy of pleasantries at work. But I am immune. I speak only with my hands, my body, my expression. My audience must feel me, not just hear me. They don't realize yet, but I'm freer than they'll ever be. Entry 15, the cage is open. Today I practiced a new piece in the park. An old woman dropped her scarf, and I returned it to her with an exaggerated bow and flourish. She laughed. She called me charming. But when she asked my name, I said nothing. I stayed in character. She became uneasy, confused. Her face twisted into something ugly, a reminder of how desperately people need words to feel secure. I left her there, still talking. Let her choke on her questions. Entry 29, society is the real mime. Why do they fear me now? Yesterday, I performed in the square. My act was flawless, a desperate man clawing his way out of an invisible box. The audience watched in silence, rapt. Then a boy whispered to his mother, "Why doesn't he talk?" She pulled him away like I was diseased. Why do they need my voice? They hear voices all day and understand nothing. My silence is a gift. It forces them to listen, really listen. But they reject it. They reject me. Entry 42, rehearsal of madness. I've stopped speaking entirely. At first, it was difficult. My mind would scream to form words, and I would catch my lips twitching in protest. But now, I've mastered the stillness. My voice feels like an ancient relic, buried beneath layers of paint. My gestures have grown more precise, more powerful. I can see it in their eyes, they understand, even if they are too afraid to admit it. My movements transcend language. I am no longer just a mime. I am truth. Entry 50, the world without me. I've stopped going into town. It's too noisy, too false. The faces leer at me, mouths flapping like gaping wounds. They cannot understand me, and I cannot abide their chaos. Instead, I perform for the mirrors in my home. I practice tirelessly, perfecting the subtleties of expression. There is an audience here that appreciates me, the shadows cast on the walls, the faint creaks of the floorboards. They see me. Sometimes I feel a presence watching. I don't turn around. Entry 71, communication is a lie. Today I performed for the mirror again. But this time, the reflection didn't move with me. I raised my hand, it stayed at its side. I tilted my head, it stood still. And then it smiled. For the first time in weeks, I heard a sound, a wet, gurgling laugh, muffled as if underwater. I fled the room, but even now, I feel it watching. My reflection has learned something I have not. It knows a secret about silence that I have yet to uncover. Entry 89, the ultimate gesture. I realize now that society is a performance, and I am its sole spectator. They are the mimes, pretending to care, pretending to feel. I am the only one who has broken free of the script. But there is one final act. The mirror beckons me. My reflection's smile has grown wider, its painted face more vivid. It motions for me to join it, miming a doorway only I can see. I understand now, the ultimate act of mime is to become invisible entirely. To vanish into the art. Final entry, the quiet room. The journal was discovered in the abandoned home of Laurent Duval, a local mime artist reported missing several weeks ago. Inside, investigators found a single chair facing a shattered mirror. The walls of the room were covered in smudged white paint, marked with frantic handprints and streaks of red, as if from fingernails clawing at an invisible surface. The body was never found. Only a pair of white gloves remained, placed neatly on the chair, palms facing upward, as though holding something unseen. And on the largest shard of broken mirror was scrawled, in smeared paint. No words left.
The man in the bakery was smiling, an ordinary act, an everyday occurrence, except his smile didn't reach his eyes. They remained cold, lifeless, like two polished marbles reflecting a distorted world. That's when the first tremor of unease ran down John's spine. The world, once a familiar comfort, began to feel like a stage set, the people mere actors. Their movements were too deliberate, their words rehearsed. John hurried out, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The sun felt too bright, the colors too vivid. The laughter of children playing in the park grated on his nerves, their joyous shrieks sounding like the cries of something inhuman. He pressed on, seeking refuge in the familiar chaos of his apartment building. But even the familiar felt wrong. The air hung heavy, thick with an unseen tension. His landlady, usually a chatty woman, merely nodded, her eyes holding a strange, knowing glint. John fumbled with his keys, his hand trembling. He needed to get inside to shut out the world that suddenly felt so alien. Reaching his apartment door, John caught his reflection in the tarnished brass of the peephole. His face, normally unremarkable, seemed distorted, his eyes wide and haunted. A stranger stared back at him, fear, raw and primal, coiled in the pit of his stomach. The apartment offered no solace. The silence was deafening, broken only by the incessant ticking of the grandfather clock he'd inherited from his grandmother. Each tick was a hammer blow against his sanity. The walls seemed to press in, suffocating him. He drew the curtains, plunging the room into an unsettling gloom. He tried to distract himself, but the outside world had seeped into his sanctuary. The television flickered with news reports of bizarre occurrences, unexplained phenomena, people acting strangely, violently. Every report was another crack in the facade of reality, fueling the growing paranoia within him. The phone rang, the shrill sound making him jump. He stared at it, heart hammering. He knew with chilling certainty that it wasn't a friendly voice on the other end. It would be another one of them, hiding behind a facade of normalcy. He let it ring, the unanswered call a testament to his crumbling sanity. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued him, filled with distorted faces and accusing eyes. He would wake in a cold sweat, the line between dream and reality blurring. He was adrift in a sea of madness, the familiar landmarks of his life swallowed by the waves. The line was crossed during a routine trip to the grocery store. The cashier, a young woman with vacant eyes and a plastic smile, looked at him a beat too long. Her voice, when she spoke, was a robotic monotone, devoid of any human inflection. "That'll be $12.50, sir," she said, her eyes boring into him. That was it, the confirmation he needed. She wasn't real, none of them were. They were puppets, automatons, put here to mock him. He felt a surge of rage, hot and consuming. He wouldn't be mocked. He wouldn't be controlled. John lunged, his hand clamping over her mouth, stifling her surprised gasp. Her eyes widened in genuine fear, the first real emotion he had seen in days. This only fueled his rage. She wasn't supposed to react like that. It was all wrong. He didn't remember much of what happened next. A blur of motion, the metallic tang of blood, the screams of onlookers that sounded distant and unimportant. He walked out of the store, leaving chaos and terror in his wake, a strange sense of calm washing over him. The unreal had been dealt with. Back in his apartment, John surveyed his handiwork. His clothes were stained, his hands trembling slightly, but he felt no remorse, no guilt, only a sense of grim satisfaction. He had done what was necessary. He had peeled back the layer of artifice, exposed the truth beneath. He turned on the television expecting to see news of his actions. But there was nothing. The news played on, the unliving. He was a prisoner in his own life, the bars invisible but no less real. He paced his apartment, a caged animal, his mind racing. He had to do something, had to fight back. The phone rang again, and this time he answered. A raspy voice greeted him, filled with amusement and something else, something colder. "You're doing well," the voice said, "but you're not finished yet. There are more of them out there, so many more." The voice on the phone, whoever it belonged to, was right. They were everywhere, on the streets, in the shops, in the flickering images on his television screen. Their faces swam before his eyes, a grotesque gallery of the unreal. He became a phantom drifting through the city, his only purpose to expose them, to tear down their charade. He saw the telltale signs everywhere, the vacant eyes, the plastic smiles, the words that sounded rehearsed, devoid of true meaning. He left his mark on the city, a trail of chaos and fear, a whispered word, a knowing look, a sudden outburst, each interaction a confirmation of his shattered reality. The world was a stage, and he was the only one who saw the strings. But with each act of defiance, a strange sense of exhilaration grew within him. He was fighting back, striking a blow against the puppet masters. He was no longer a pawn in their game. He was the one pulling the strings now. The city became his hunting ground, his personal asylum of madness. Sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford. Food tasted like ash in his mouth. He was a man possessed, driven by a truth that only he could see. The line between reality and delusion had vanished completely. He heard whispers in the wind, saw conspiracies in the most mundane events. The world was a tapestry of lies, and he was the only one who could see the threads unraveling. The police were closing in, he could feel it. Their faces, once a symbol of authority, now filled him with a cold dread. They were in on it, of course, they had to be. They were part of the grand illusion. He became a shadow, moving from one hiding place to another, always looking over his shoulder. The city, once familiar and comforting, was now a labyrinth of paranoia and fear. They finally caught him, as they always do. He barely resisted, his body and mind exhausted from the relentless pursuit of truth. They led him away, not to a jail cell, but to a sterile white room with padded walls. A man in a white coat sat across from him, his face a mask of professional concern. The doctor, they called him. But John saw through the facade. "John," the doctor began, his voice soft and reassuring, "we're here to help you. You've been under a lot of stress lately. You're safe now." John laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Safe?" he echoed. "Safe from what? The truth?" The doctor smiled, didn't falter. "Let's talk about what happened, John. Tell me about the people you saw, the things they made you do." John shook his head, his laughter turning into a sob. They would never understand. They couldn't understand. They were part of it. They were the ones who made him do it. Days turned into weeks. The doctor continued to visit, his smile unwavering, his words like a broken record. John retreated further into himself, his grip on reality slipping with each passing hour. He saw the other patients, their faces vacant, their eyes reflecting the same empty sky. They were all the same, all part of the lie. Then one day the doctor arrived with a triumphant smile. "You're making progress, John," he said, holding up a small orange pill. "This will help. It will make the nightmares go away." John stared at the pill, a sense of dread washing over him. He knew what it was. It was the final step, the ultimate betrayal. They were going to erase him, turn him into one of them. He lunged for the doctor, his hands closing around his throat. "You can't!" he screamed, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I'm the only real one left!" The doctor struggled, his eyes wide with genuine fear. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was real. And John, for the first time since his descent into madness, felt a pang of doubt. Had he been wrong all along?
Shadows cast, I walk alone among the echoes of whispered tones. A question lingers, what lies beneath? A fleeting glimpse of elusive peace. I chase tonight, but it slips away. As time unravels, I start to sway. Caught in the web of my own design, searching for clarity, but still I pine. In this existential mystery I reside, over answers I can't confide. Fleeting moments turn to endless days. A love once bright, now lost in the haze. Embers smolder from a fire now cold. Each memory haunts a story retold. A fragile heart beat beneath the weight of choices made that sealed my fate. Caught in the web of my own design, searching for clarity, but still I pine. In this existential mystery I reside, hope for answers I can't confide. Silent screams echo in my mind, seeking solace but none to find. The deeper I dive, the less I know. A path untraveled where shadows grow. Caught in the web of my own design, searching for clarity, but still I pine. In this existential mystery I reside. Over answers I can't confide.